Hi, thanks so much for having me speak to you today. I'm sorry that I can't be with you. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Anya. I moved with my family here to Leicester about a year and a half ago, and we started coming to St John's around then. I'm married to Luke, who is a vicar, and he's currently working as a university chaplain. We've got three little boys, Micah, Nathan and Jesse, who are 6, 4 and 2, so we are kept very busy with them. As I begin, I wonder if any of you can relate to the feeling of desperately waiting for something. Actually, I know you can, as all of us are longing and yearning for a time when we can see family and friends again. But I want to share a story with you from my life of having those similar feelings of missing people, but back in happier times. I was 19, I was going to America for a year to study. This was the longest time I'd been away from home, and so it was a big deal, and I knew that I would miss my family. Actually, to be honest, in reality I was having quite a lot of fun exploring America and learning new things that I think it was probably harder on my mum and dad. I'm their eldest child, and for the first ever time I wouldn't see them for the best part of a year. I wouldn't have Christmas with them. I was in Montana, which is in the middle of nowhere, and so saying goodbye at the airport, as you can imagine, was a sad moment. Made even more sad by the fact that when I went through security, there was kind of this long hall that we both had to walk through, but that was separated by a glass wall down the middle, and I was on one side, my parents were on the other, and we had to do this kind of long sad walk where we were separated but we could still see each other, but we couldn't hug or talk, and then we just kept going till I disappeared off. It was quite dramatic, and I think my parents found it hard without me there. But before this, in November, they had this trip booked, kind of like a once-in-a-lifetime trip, where they were going to Florida to see my auntie and uncle that lived there and their family. They asked if I could come, but Montana is a long way from Florida, and at the time I thought I couldn't. But my aunt and uncle, they hatched this generous plan to sort of fly me down from Montana so that I could surprise my family in Florida. And as you can imagine, I was very excited. They were all sat in a restaurant one evening, and the waiters and waitresses were all in on this plan. Friends of my aunt came and picked me up from the airport and brought me to this restaurant where I kind of casually walked in. My mum, dad, sister and granddad were all there, and the place just exploded. We had this kind of incredible reunion moment. After half an hour or so, they mostly got over the main shock of it, except my dad, for some reason, who was still sat there with his head in his hands, shaking his head, just saying, "I can't believe it," over and over again. To go from that feeling of missing someone, or that feeling of desperate waiting, and then to have this sudden kind of moment of breakthrough where your longings are realised. It's such a rich and profound experience. When I first looked at the passage today, I feel like it captures this feeling, that moment of sudden breakthrough that so many of us want and need. One of my favourite things about John the Baptist is not just what he says, but the situation that he was speaking into. The deep, dark and long silence from God that came before him. In terms of hearing the voice of God, it doesn't get much clearer than an eccentric, locust-eating man, anointed with the Spirit of God, crying out in the wilderness, telling people exactly what God was saying to them in that moment. Prepare, get ready. Something unimaginable is coming soon, and you need to get right. Sort yourselves out. Sometimes I wish that God would speak to me this clearly, to just send me a note, or even a crazy man, with some direction, and tell me clearly why certain things are happening and when they're going to change. But then I remember what came before John, and I think this is where the story touches my heart in a new and a different way. and I think might have something to say to us here today. I think the voice of John the Baptist has this meaning when we realise what came before him. The Old Testament is filled with stories of God's love, of God's pursuing, of God forgiving for thousands of years. It is rich with God's voice. The presence of God dwelt in the temple, and he spoke through judges, kings, prophets, even a donkey at one point, to try and build a relationship with his people. But time and time again, they would turn away from him to false gods and idols. God warned them of where this would lead, and after thousands of years of this same toxic cycle, they were eventually invaded, captured, put into exile. A long time later, a remnant did return to the promised land, but they were weak. They were overtaken by big and powerful nations, time and time again. Babylon, Greece, and then the Romans. They were made to speak different languages and pay taxes to a foreign government. And for 400 years, God's people were waiting. There were no prophets. There were no new biblical texts written. Just silence from God and war from their enemies. They were holding on to the promise of a Messiah and a Saviour. But I wonder if and when God's people started to lose hope in this promise. I don't know about you, but I can relate to this feeling of waiting or yearning for something to change. We know the hope we have in Jesus, we know the promises, and yet life happens. Things chip and erode away at our spirits. The voice of God that once felt so clear becomes vague and even silent sometimes. Perhaps now more than ever, so many of us are experiencing this all at once. It's like our lives have been paused. For some of us, the lonely monotony of lockdown has taken over us with a kind of lethargy. We feel pointless, we feel useless. For others, the anxiety has taken over, whether it's for our jobs or our businesses, or whether it's for the creeping threat of an invisible illness waiting to pounce. I'll be honest, for me, I feel burnt out. I feel like I had this kind of positivity at the start, a kind of survival instinct that said that I could step up and do this, that we would learn some good lessons and find a new normal that was even better than before. But I have 3 small children, and somewhere along the line, creative homeschool projects and camping out in the garden became watching a film every day and just trying to survive. I'm tired. And this isn't to say it's all bad. I think for some of us there have been some real richness in this season. But I think Advent offers us a chance to be real. The chance to say, I'm struggling, and to lean into that feeling instead of running away from it. Advent, in its very nature, is a season of lack. It's a season of waiting and preparing. And so it's a time we can accept not having all the answers. I love this part of the Bible where it switches from the Old to the New Testament, because it's just one empty page. But in reality, it was 400 years of births and deaths, of life not meeting expectations, and this is what John was speaking into. I don't know if any of you, like me, went into adulthood with a plan of what life was supposed to look like. We set out with expectations, don't we? Expectations for a career, for marriage, for children maybe, for good health. We assume we have choices in all of these things. As Christians, maybe we expect that our lives will be full of miracles and breakthroughs and exciting stories and God using us to change the world. Embarrassingly, I had a plan like this. When I was a teenager, I felt called to work with other Christians in some way. I wanted to lead, pastor, disciple, to see real change happen in the church. I did gap years, I did mission trips, I studied the Bible, I studied theology. I could have handed my plan to God on a piece of paper and said, This is how it's going to go. And God, you'll thank me for it because it involves helping a lot of people in your name. But as you can imagine, I got a reality check. I got married to Luke while he was going through the ordination process. But I had become ill with a long-term illness. At that point, I couldn't finish my theology degree and I couldn't get involved in ministry. I instead watched Luke doing church work from the sidelines while I completed the 24 box set and finished Sonic 2 on the Xbox. Life happened, I guess. I got better, but then I had to finish off my degree. And being ill had left me with this kind of anxiety that meant that I still couldn't get very involved with things. I then got pregnant. For various reasons, I wanted to be at home with the children for the first few years of their life, at least until they're at school. So again, I found myself watching church ministry from the sidelines in city after city, in church after church. I had a lot to work through in that time. Did God not want to use me? Was I not valuable to him? Was the call I felt at a young age real? It's like I was waving my plan around saying, God, this is how it was supposed to go. And it would have been really good. But when I look back now at the last 10 years or so, I am in awe of the tapestry of meaning and depth that God has weaved while I wasn't even looking. I had a pride that I hadn't even realised was there that needed to be stripped back. There was a whisper, sometimes so quiet that I couldn't hear it, from God saying that he was with me in the normal, unexpected chaos of life, that I wasn't off track. It didn't make sense to me, but God could see something different to what I could see. Somehow, and I'm not even sure how, my journey of doing less and feeling on the sidelines has created in me a passion for slower and deeper living that I want to keep exploring and want to try and help other people in as well. I've got a connection now with the people in the margins that was never there before, a sense that God dwells in the questions and the doubts, that those who can't get as involved in church life because of disability, mental health, having young children, old age, and many other reasons, that actually these are the people often at the epicenter of God's redemption and love. That something doesn't have to be outwardly productive to have immense meaning. I look back at my life and I can see good moments and hard moments and a tapestry that God has weaved through all of these things, not despite them. God does not ordain or plan our struggle, but he does dwell in it with us. I hate to say it, but his plan makes a lot more sense to me now than my original plan ever did. The times in our life where we feel like we're lacking progress or we're just getting silence from God aren't to be dodged or ashamed about, as though they get in the way of his work in us. There are times when we have to live with the empty spaces, like when tragedy pulls the rug from under our feet, or our capacity doesn't feel like what it used to be, or when a global pandemic hits. For God's people, it was 400 years of waiting. I am reading this book at the moment called Wintering, which I would hugely recommend. And it talks about when we go through seasons of our life that feel cold and hard and empty. I think a lot of us might feel like that right now. That we're in a season without much new growth, of feeling tired and unproductive maybe. Unlike nature, sometimes we try and keep going through these seasons, acting like everything's normal and keeping up the same pace and commitments. But these seasons are hard, and we need to adapt to them, just like all of nature instinctively does. Advent is a season of preparing ourselves for what is coming. And this makes the voice of John so relevant to us today. Make straight the way of the Lord. Like a squirrel foraging away nuts or a dormouse seeking a place to hibernate. How do we adapt and prepare for the season that we are in? For Christmas and beyond, for the months of winter and COVID that are still coming. In this book, the author makes the point that the trees don't just die in winter. They are still a huge part of the ecosystem of the forest, but just in a different way. They provide nuts and pine cones for food. They provide shelter. And most importantly, they are resting and absorbing water ready for when the season changes. I didn't know this, but the buds of spring are there throughout winter. They just have a protective layer around them to prevent them from damage. I think sometimes we need to put a protective layer around ourselves, to give ourselves permission to let go of things and be less productive, to rest and to recuperate and maybe to hibernate if we need to, ready for a new season. And strangely, it's often in these harshest seasons that the most profound growth can happen, without us even noticing. We long for summer, but we shouldn't resist what winter can teach us. And I want to end with this. Advent isn't a vague waiting for something that may or may not happen. It's not waiting for a bus that will never come. For God's people, in their 400 years of waiting and silence, there was a moment of breakthrough. There was an endpoint. A voice in the wilderness crying out that hope was coming, crying out for people to prepare rather than passively wait without much hope, to make changes and have open hearts ready for when breakthrough comes. I think we need to know that our waiting is an expectant waiting, whether it's for the end of coronavirus, whether it's for our lives to change, whether it's for Jesus to come again and for all to be made new. God doesn't keep us in an eternal winter. There is hope. His timing is perfect. Spring will come, but don't miss what winter has for you. Thank you.